Finding America, Seeking New Paleolithic Paradigms. Two things I want to say about this slide. Notice what direction the troop of intrepid travelers is walking. They're going west from Alaska instead of east down the Bering Land Bridge. And it's paradigms, not paradigm. Because what we now know is that there's probably many, many ways people got to the Americas, not just one. And many people from maybe many directions we haven't even thought of yet. So what I want to do today is talk about some of these ideas. And where I want to start, since this is a discussion about Lindenmeier, Folsom, and the early ideas of the peopling of Americas, I want to say just a few words. One of which was that the attitude of the Smithsonian Institution back in the 20s and earlier was one that people had not been in North America very long, maybe 6,000 years at most, and definitely not with Pleistocene animals. And so the discoveries that were made by Figgins from the Colorado Museum down at Folsom, New Mexico, were kind of taboo to the upper echelons at the Smithsonian. And Figgins, after the excavations, or starting the excavations, came to Washington, D.C. to visit his friend, a geologist at the Smithsonian by the name of O.P. Hay, and discuss the new finds at Folsom. And at that time, they invited the anthropologist down to look at the Folsom Points and talk about the issues. And of course, they were not too excited about it. Neil Judd, who had been excavating out in New Mexico at the time at Chaco Canyon, along with Mr. Roberts, who you all know. And he and the chief curator just basically got real unhappy about the Folsom situation, and a lot of discussion was made, and Neil said, you know, there are fluted points all over the place. In fact, we got one of these so-called Folsom Points at Chaco Canyon just last year. And so Figgins said, well, let's see that point. And so Neil ran off to find it. Meanwhile, I've taken most of the letter out because it's pretty derisive and not fun, and I've been down that road many times. So I want to talk about happier notes, but as it turns out, Neil could not find the Clovis Point. And when Figgins got back to Denver, he sent a letter off to O.P. Hay, said, yeah, and that little banty rooster, he couldn't find his Folsom Point, ha, ha, ha. Well, I have, and there it is. It's a beauty, isn't it? It's made out of Arizona wood, found in Chaco Canyon by the crew out there. And no wonder Neil was a little bit exercised. So I got to thinking, you know, what is it that was causing at least Neil Judd, who I knew quite well actually in his later days, is a very good scientist. And I just wondered what it is that makes one wonder why that would be a young point. And here's the first Clovis Point ever returned to the Smithsonian Institution. What is it? What is it? It's a Clovis Point from Idaho, collected by the military doctor during the Idaho campaigns in 69. Yeah, that's why we have slides here. And look at what department it's cataloged under. Ethnology. That's a spear point or a knife used by a Nez Perce Indian. Well, Here's another one. Here's a stone dagger. Here's a prehistoric knife from Pike County, Missouri. Here, now this is kind of a fun one, 14 Clovis points made out of obsidian from Susanville, California. Notice down here that we traded these 14 points off to museums around the world as really good examples of Indian knives. Now, there in the card there are two areas, two museums that received one of these points. I also found out more recently that the museum at Les Aizés in France has one. And so it'd be kind of fun to get them together because I think we're looking at a Clovis cache from California. And here, this is just pulling together all of the fluted points that the Smithsonian has from the state of Georgia before the turn of the century. Now, we understand why Neil Judd said, oh, there's lots of those. And they're modern. What kind of story are you trying to sell us? Now, fortunately, Frank Roberts was there, and he had gone out to the site, and the Folsom site, and he thought, well, you know, there's probably something to this, even though the first projectile point was not in place. But so I think that's probably why it piqued his interest to go to Lindenmeier, because of that early discussions that he was in on every one of them. Now, and how bad it might have been and what loss we have from these decisions was a man named Ridgely Whiteman from Clovis, New Mexico, the same year as Folsom, heard about the Folsom site, sent a Clovis point into the Smithsonian and said that it was found with mammoths. The Smithsonian sent it back and said, this is an example of an Indian knife. Don't worry about it. Hence, it was another 8 years before excavations were done at Clovis, New Mexico. Then, of course, we all know the story about how Clovis people got into the New World. Crossed the Bering Land Bridge, living in Alaska, moving down through the ice-free corridor, populating all of North America and eating all of the megafauna. In 1949, the geologic crew working on the Uticuk River in Alaska found this point right there. And in 1951, I just found out a paper was published in Scientific American on this is the proof that Clovis people came from Asia, went down the Bering Land Bridge, and populated America. Bam, we got the answer. Well, in 1968, two young graduate students from the University of New Mexico, one of which looks a lot like me, went up to look at this site and see what was there. And by golly, we found it. We found Selecki's site, and we found more fluted points. We thought, well, this is pretty neat. There was even some mammoth bone there. We got a radiocarbon date of 22,000 on that mammoth bone. So Bob Humphrey got a dissertation out of it, and I went on to work at Blackwater Murray Springs with Vance Haynes, but it introduced me to the Arctic, which I fell in love with. And after a summer of digging at Murray Springs, I look forward to getting back to Alaska the following summer. We now have probably 35 fluted point sites in Alaska, and we now have radiocarbon dates on those sites. Take a guess at what they date. Right at 10,000 years old, slightly younger than Folsom. what does that do to our ice-free corridor? Plus, if you look at that ice-free corridor, how many big red dots do you see? Well, all I can say about that situation is it was a wonderful opportunity for me because I wanted to stay in Alaska and work in Alaska and resolve this issue, which I did for a number of years, and brought me to Point Barrow, Kotzebue, and many native friends, and understanding how you survive in a true ice age climate, what you need to do to survive, and how you can make it work for you so that it's home sweet home. And it was a marvelous experience. So, keeping that in the back of my mind, I got to thinking about Clovis indeed. And some things started to make real sense to me. One of which was the number of Clovis sites on the East Coast, which, remember those from Georgia? Well, there's more from Virginia. There's more from Maryland. There's more from Delaware. There's more from Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida. I mean, this is just one map that Peggy was talking about yesterday of Clovis sites on the Delmarva Peninsula on the Chesapeake Bay. That's a lot of people. And at Clovis times, this was pretty much a big running river. And all these sites up here are basically small sites with 2 or 3 points, which are kill sites. The big sites are going to be right down here along the river. And you can follow this pattern all the way down the coast. This site right here, I might talk about a little bit. It's one we're working on right now. It's a submerged Clovis site. And we're getting some real interesting tools besides what you normally see in a Clovis site. We're getting tools that are for heavy woodworking, lots of woodworking. We have over 300 wedges, chisel blades, large concave scrapers, a series of tools that you never see, particularly in Clovis sites, except for a couple of them that are further up the coast here, and all of them have the same issue. During Clovis times, the Chesapeake Bay was beginning to form up in here. This site is just slightly above the Chesapeake Bay on a freshwater stream, one where there are trees, and close to the Chesapeake Bay, developing Chesapeake Bay, where there are lots and lots of resources. And I think the first people in this area along the coast were really well fed, and well fed because of the marine coastal resources. And the populations, I think, would just blow us away if we had some real way of counting them. So those kinds of issues, I began to think quite a bit about, well, Clovis may well have developed in the eastern part of the United States. And so then in a paper I wrote, I thought, well, you know, they had to have come from Siberia, one way or another, Asia. We all know that. It's been drummed into us forever. So I said, well, the only thing I can see that may be pre-Clovis in the eastern United States is what we now call Page-Ladson projectile points, which look like Clovis points that are unfluted. And so I hypothesized that that might have been pre-Clovis. Of course, I got a little trouble for that. But nonetheless, this stuff's now dated. It is pre-Clovis, dates 14,000. And I'll talk about that more later. But what happened to Clovis? Don't know. But they sure went west in a heck of a hurry, and probably because of, I think, the Younger Dryas. This is pure speculation. But when the Younger Dryas hit, and the climate changed so rapidly overnight, basically, that it wiped out all those estuarian resources that were all up and down these rivers. And I think we had a big population. I think that population had to move out. No data for that, other than looking at caches And I'm sure you all know about Clovis caches. They're places where Clovis people left lots of artifacts in a cache, and we don't quite know whether they're for coming back to or for maybe even trading. All right. What I wanted to point out with these caches, at least the ones that Bruce Bradley and I were able to analyze a number of years ago, and it may have changed some because there's more new caches, that the raw material, like here's Edwards Plateau moving up towards Clovis, the source of this raw material is mostly moving north and west. And I think that's indicative of the direction these people were going for whatever reason. And the cache I like best is one from right over here in St. Louis, Missouri, called the McKenna cache. And why I like that best is one of the bifaces from that cache was found over here where the Snake River goes into the Columbia. All right, look at this. Up here to the Lolo Trail, over to the Snake, down to the Columbia. Where did Sacagawea learn that trail? This is really the first voyage of discovery. So, did Clovis people have boats? I'd say they did. I think we were getting some pretty good data to support that idea. One of which is this map that was just produced by the Army at Fort Drum. And look at how much water's out there in Clovis days. You couldn't actually get around that country without watercraft, to tell you the truth. Just think about that. So, what we're left with after that rumination is that we now have some areas where we have good pre-Clovis radiocarbon dates, in my opinion. The one that I want to talk about up here is Swan Point in Alaska. And we have a date of 14,340 plus or minus something. And what comes from these sites in the Arctic are microblade cores, microblades, and these things are inset into projectile points and knives. And it's a long tradition that comes right out of Siberia. And these are the people that did cross the Bering Land Bridge many, many times, back and forth. And when I was working in Alaska, we called this technology Paleo Eskimo. The Paleo Eskimo people moved across the northern regions into Greenland. Did they become Eskimos? It was just one of those bad calls because DNA data that just came out probably in the last 2 months, these are not Eskimos at all. And the people making these types of implements are much later or much earlier than Eskimo Inuit people. And so they probably are the Duktai folks that come out of Siberia and end up over here in Greenland. And by about 3,000 years ago, the Eskimo groups were coming in. New hypothesis, about 3 weeks old. Oh, let me go back here. So beyond the Swan Point, Siberian kind of technology, these folks also moved down, this technology at least moved down to the northwest. And then our next oldest radiocarbon dates are from Paisley Cave and up here with the mammoth with the bone projectile point and its vertebrae, around 14,000 years old too. And these people make projectile points, which out west they call western stemmed. These points, one of these points was found in the Kennewick man's hip, and so we have a pretty good idea that he's a descendant of folks that come out of Japan. And if you've not seen the Kennewick book that Doug Owsley edited, it's just out last week. Please get a copy. There'll be a lot of discussion over these issues, and the book is moderately priced for what you get. It's about a 700-page book, and we did the most work we could possibly do to show people what important kinds of knowledge you can gain from looking at some of these early human remains. So I hope you look at it. On Your Knees Cave, which is a site that many of you here in Colorado probably know about. It was dug by Jim Dixon, formerly of the Denver Museum of Natural History, as I will call it. And these are western stem points, so we know that the western stem people were on the west coast of North America for at least 4,000 to 5,000 years and probably still there. And when Clovis people were moving west, they no doubt met these people. The hypothesis is that the Asians were coming around the North Pacific Rim as well as across the Bering Land Bridge because of the kelp beds and the rich resources of the coastal waters. Well, that's fair enough, and that's probably true. But the North Pacific is not much colder than the North Atlantic, so maybe we ought to broaden our thinking a little bit. Maybe not, but maybe we should. So let's move back to the East Coast. This is a Page-Ladson type projectile point. We have a date now of 14,000 on it, which matches the one in Florida. And when we look at these projectile points and tools, we can see that the people have a blade technology, a large blade technology. They're doing Burins and bifacial projectile points and overshot flaking. This is a tool made on an overshot flake, but these are Clovis points, except they're not fluted. And they're 1,000 years or 100 years older than Clovis. So when we started finding these sites on the Chesapeake Bay, and we're looking at the geology, we're beginning to pick up on some really good chronological markers. Darren Lowry, a young man who's worked with me since he was 14. And this is John Waugh, one of our soils people. And what we've discovered is, or what they've discovered, I didn't do it, that we have a Paleo Saw that is common, it's found all the way down the Susquehanna River. It's found all the way down the Delaware, and probably more rivers that we haven't looked into, because it's showing us a climatic shifts that were going on the East Coast during the end of the last glaciation. And what we have is this is all wind-blown loess caused by the Younger Dryas climatic shift. And this is when Clovis people got the heck out of the East Coast, because every Clovis site that we found is right there on that contact and their lag deposits. There must have been some tremendous windstorms. I'm going to show you a picture of a YD loess deposit here in a few minutes that's almost a 5-foot tall sand dune right on top of the Paleo Saws. But these guys noticed, fortunately. Now this is all loess. I mean, this is the YD loess. This is earlier loess. That's a big rock. What the heck is that big rock doing there? That must have been one heck of a windstorm, eh? So the day this was found, I was down looking at the Galt site, and Darren gives me a call. He said, "Dennis, you won't believe what we just found." I said, No, what? And he said, "Big rock sticking out of the loess below the YD border." I said, "Well, test it." "Oh, okay." There it is. There's the rock. Here is a wedge blade core. Here's a blade off of that bipolar wedge core. And there's yet another blade here. The rock turns out to be an anvil, and here's a hammerstone. This was exactly what we were looking for. We got a radiocarbon date of around 21,000. The property belonged to an entrepreneur, and it's just outside of a historic village there in Maryland on the Delmarva Peninsula. And he had 250 acres, the landowner did, that was right adjacent to the historic city, that he was going to put a bunch of mega mansions on. And the local historic-minded people said, no, don't ruin our village. So they got in a big lawsuit. And when we got the information on the archaeology, he said, well, I'll let you dig it, but not until after the lawsuit's over, because I don't want to give those doggone environmentalists any other ammunition to shoot at me. So we were nice, and what we did, though, was we cored the site. We knew the distribution of the Paleo Saws, and we continued to watch the site's only about 20 miles from where Darren lives, so he could be out there after every storm, because what happens is when you have a storm, then part of these nice cuts get eroded and into the ground, or into the beach. And but Darren was out there quite often, and as you can see here, where he has mapped rocks, another hammerstone, and eventually this was our assemblage that we were able to collect with the first anvil here, those artifacts, another large anvil down here, and artifacts up here, 1 and 2, and then artifacts that fell out of the wall. There was no other archaeology there, so we're relatively sure these all go together, and one of which is the distal end of an exhausted polyhedral blade core, which is this guy. These things are, at this point, just blades, but they're triangular in cross sections, and from the site, the Clovis site we're working on, in the same area, they're making these same tools, and what we think, looking at the wear patterns on them, is these are twist drills. So they're drilling something. And the projectile point, this one I would have called archaic, and Vance Haynes would have called it archaic, particularly after looking at Meadowcroft rock shelter. And then this is probably, we think, a preform for another projectile point that was never completed. So we were pretty excited about this, and we were in hopes of digging it when the lawsuit was over. Here's our occupation level. We found artifacts coming out of this contact here. And guess what happened? The housing market collapsed. The landowner went broke. The property was bought by a woman who did not want to be bothered. Well, that's how it goes. Well, let me back up here. Notice this tree here? This is where we're getting our stuff. There it is. The oldest campsite yet found in North America got bulldozed away, covered with rock. Because the state of Maryland said there's no such thing as PreClovis. That's probably true. But we were always entertained. And another time, Darren was writing his dissertation at this point on coastal geomorphology and development. And he was looking at an exhibit in a small island down in the Chesapeake. And he went to the little local museum, and he sees a large bifacial knife and some mammoth bone, a mammoth tusk, and mammoth tooth. The sign said, dredged from the Chesapeake Bay. And Darren looked at the biface, and he said, oh, Dennis might be interested in that one. And there it is. It's a classic laurel leaf Solutrean style knife. And so he called me up, and I said, well, we better come down and look at that. So we did, and the museum ladies let us borrow it, let us borrow the tusk and the tooth. We sent the tusk and tooth to Tom Stafford. Tom came back with a date of 22,000. We interviewed the captain of the boat, and let's go back to the boat. The find was made probably 20, 30 years ago, 1974, I believe. And they were using this 1950 style boat. They were 50-some miles off the coast of Virginia, fishing and dredging in 250 feet of water, right at the edge of the continental shelf. When they hit a solid object, and for a little boat like this, it was a disaster. So what did they do? The solid object, as they worked it up real slowly, and they had to work it up slowly because the winch was on a wooden deck, and it was heavier than heck, and so they had to work it around, finally get it up, and it was full of mastodon remains, mostly skull and tusk and teeth. And here these fishermen are, 50 miles, and we've been out there, and it takes 7 hours in a modern boat to get out there, let alone one of these old wooden ones, and they had to make a living. So they started throwing the stuff overboard. And the tusk was in really good condition, so they got a hacksaw out and chopped it up in pieces, and each of the, good idea, each of the crew members, there were 12 crew members on the boat, got a piece of the tusk and the 4 teeth, and they were divided up. And then they found the knife, and so the captain kept the knife. Darren was able to interview the captain, even though it had been 20 years since they had done the work. And we found out 2 things. One, he had a Lorenz reading on where it happened, because these fishing boats carry what they call a hang log. And when they hit something like this that stops their work, they record its Lorenz position in those days. And that's passed on to the harbor master so that when you're out there fishing, you can avoid that area. And so he had that data that he gave to Darren. So we knew roughly where he hit that material. And we were going to interview him for a film, and he died within a week before we got back down there, which is too bad. But nonetheless, I want to show you this knife. It came up with the bones, and it's a classic knife. Marvin Kaye did use wear on it, and what we can see from the use wear is that it was a hafted knife. The red here shows where there's real heavy use, like it's really going through something pretty solid, like a mastodon hair. The yellow is where the boat dinged it when it was pulling up the load. And then the knife had been resharpened before it was lost and never used again, which is pretty neat. But it tells us a bunch of things. One, because of the ability of Marvin Kaye to decipher this wear pattern analysis, tells us that that knife was not drug very far on the bottom of the ocean before it was pulled up and damaged by the load that was in that thing. That's a pretty pristine knife. And you can see by the thickness of it, it's a nice, pretty delicate instrument. So what we did this gives you an idea of what kinds of things come up when you dredge one up. This is a side dredger. And what they're doing here is shoveling the dead ones back overboard. We had the readings. Let's go find what's out there. And so with a private donation, we were able to go out summer before last with underwater mapping equipment, and we went to the location spot, and look what we see. Here's the dredge line. Here's the animal. Here's where he drifted off as they cleaned it, came back online and went. I think that's pretty phenomenal. Now, fortunately for us, the Virginia fisheries closed that area for fishing that same year, and it's not open yet again. We now know why. We didn't know at the time, but there is a crashed jet airplane, military airplane out there with a live bomb on it. And we were dragging a sled all over it, not knowing that. We weren't fishing. We didn't need a permit to do that. So, but the bottom line is, there's something still left out there, but it's in 250 feet of water. But we're going out next summer again with a submersible and explore around it. The Department of Environment and Economic Board is going to supply the equipment for us as long as I can supply the boat. So if anybody wants to buy us a boat, let me know. And then we will send the rover down. It'll have the capability of giving us a live photography for moving dirt, moving bones. If we want to bring up an elephant bone, if we happen to find one, we'll have to put a basket down there, but the underwater equipment can load it into the basket. We can pull it up. So it's going to be kind of fun, and we'll see what we find. But digging a site in 250 feet of water is probably going to be impossible. But keep in mind that knife and that elephant, that mastodon, were buried in a freshwater peat bog, which preserved them, like the Danish burials, because there's no oxygen getting in there. That knife is from a source in Pennsylvania called South Mountain Rhyolite, which is a high iron content. If that knife had not been in that peat bog any length of time, that iron would have reacted with the salt water, and the knife would have been gone in 7,000 to 8,000 years or more or less. The elephant, the mastodon, ivory, was stained, and the knife had started to react to salt water. So what had happened was that 14,000 years ago, when there was a climatic shift and we had a major rise in sea level called the meltwater pulse 1A, when that water started to rise above that peat bog, it formed a saltwater marsh. And that saltwater marsh started to chemically react with both the ivory and the stone tool. Had that remained a saltwater marsh, the knife would have been gone. But it didn't, because sea level was rising so fast that eventually it was out of the oxygenated levels and preserved until Captain Sean hit the bone bed. So that tells us two things. One, we don't know for sure if that knife and that mastodon go together. There's a good possibility they do, but the one thing we can say for sure is that that knife is over 14,500 years old. So we'll let it go at that. But talking to the ladies that run the little museum there in Gwynn Island, said, these fishermen find this stuff all the time. So, well, this would be kind of a fun thing to do. Let's do a Smithsonian Identa Day at your museum. Cool. I said, you advertise it. Call all your fishing captains and seamen to bring in the things they find. And I'll have a historian here, I'll have paleontologists here, and I'll have archaeologists here. And we'll identify everything for 2 days and have a good time. So we did. And we got, as a result, more of these artifacts. I mean, they brought in literally hundreds of, maybe even thousands of artifacts have been drained off the whole area. But these fit the same model. And all of these at the bottom are the ones from the Chesapeake Bay. This is the Sinmar knife. No, this is a bigger knife. This is the Sinmar knife. And what basically the French have different names for each of these knife styles. But what it is this is an unused knife. This is a resharpened knife. This is a more resharpened knife. And this is a totally resharpened knife. So it's kind of the... you can see they're not Antelope Creek focus knives that have the 4 bevels. These knives only have 2, so they were keeping them pretty well hafted. Just about a year ago, Darren was, we were having some troubles figuring out our radiocarbon dates on that Paleo Saw. And Darren had noticed on this island here a massive amount of a Paleo Saw, a real thick Paleo Saw. So he and Dan Wagner and John decided to go over and map that. And while they were mapping, here you can see the Paleo Saws. This is the younger Dryas Lus. Look at how big a sand dune is over this earlier material. And Darren is pointing to something down here that I'd like you to see. You guys see that? Right at the top of that AB2 soil. That's a knife, quite like the one from the Sinmar site. And there's charcoal on top of it. We got a date on that charcoal. Radiocarbon date of 17,000. It'll correct to around 20,000. Right there on that line. So we have been mapping. This is the one you just saw sticking out of the bank right here, this little guy. Then we got another bigger one, a nice one. And these two, since they were in situ, I sent them off for blood residue analysis. And this one has camel antiserum reaction, and this one's bison. And I said, when I got the answers back, well, I'm a little worried about this blood residue analysis. But, we don't have many camels and bison around here, even during the Ice Age. But then, the next time out there, what did we get? Bison teeth. We now have, we think, one camel tooth and a muskox tooth. So, and all of those are now beginning to fit the pollen record that we put together. So, at this point, we've got these tools, and a projectile point. And it looks just like the one from Miles Point and the one from Meadowcroft. Cool, huh? This, we believe, is another preform, and this is a blade, a tool made on a blade called a point à face plan. And it's, I guess, a knife or a butchering tool or a projectile point. And what you're looking at here is our most recent find. This is a point very similar to a Solutrean type point called a single-shouldered projectile point. It is made on a blade, and we now have at least 3 blades from the site. So we basically, at this point, can duplicate a Solutrean stone technology assemblage, as we have all of the point types, we have the blade type. So we're happy with it. Here are the radiocarbon dates that we have on these sites here in the Chesapeake Bay out to the Sinmar. So I guess what we're looking at is some people are here around 20,000 years ago, and I think that is getting to be a pretty solid argument. Even yet, we have 3 more projectile points that we can put in this line, and the state of Maryland don't have any of these on their state point type book. And here's a Solutrean one. I don't know what to say. They may not be related. It may be a case of independent invention. But to me, independent invention might be all right for 1 or 2 artifacts. But when we look at our stone tools, we don't have any bone tools at this point here. They're the same. That's a lot of independent invention, in my opinion. So you want to hear more of the story? Oh, okay. So now I'm going to go out the real deep end. If they didn't come from Europe, where did they come from? Where else can you get that technology 20,000 years ago? No place that I can think of other than right here. And Solutrean itself is kind of an interesting, complex situation. And what we found is that our tool assemblage matches this group right here quite well. And as you move inland, it changes considerably. And there are some artifacts you get in the French Solutrean, and particularly down in this area, that we don't get over here, and neither do they. And our hypothesis is that this is the coastline at the time the Solutrean people were living here. The environment of Europe was pretty bad at that point in time, and probably the best places to live would be right along the ocean margin. So we suspect that if we can ever get out there, there's going to be Solutrean sites in this whole area through here, and we know they're over in England. There's at least 4 sites that are there. And this is likely pretty good environment for these people to be. This is the background. And looking at the range of Solutrean sites here in this close-up of Spain, the points that look like this with concave bases, and some of them even have partial flutes, or at least basal thinning, come from the sites that have the triangles. And those sites have earliest Solutrean occupations, whereas the round ones have later Solutrean occupation. And we can see that all of these sites, they're in the Picos de Europa, are in the highlands, but they're also on river courses that come down to major estuaries that I think are home base, basically, is probably down here. And they're moving up, particularly in the fall, to these higher altitude sites for red deer. And I think it'd be really fun to be able to get out and work that continental shelf. When we start comparing Solutrean to Clovis, which is what Bruce and I wanted to do because of the technology, and it became really clear to us, at least, that it goes from Solutrean in North America to the Page-Ladson into Clovis over about a 4,000-year time period. But the technology pretty well stays the same all the way through it, including large blades, byrinated tools, these things. It's all pretty common for those of us here. And basically the only difference in this technology is the way they're moving their base off. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about overshot flaking. Some people say that that's our major thing that we're looking at to compare technology, and it's not. It's just one of many, many things. But we've been talked about that the key element, we thought key element was real interesting, giving the radiocarbon dates and the tools, and even the bone tools are the same. The use of controlled overshot flaking. Well, okay, that is a key element, but not the key element. But the question was answered by experimental and archaeological data that suggests that overshot flakes are accidental. Huh. Isn't that interesting? Well, I got that copy of that paper this last year. The same day I got a picture of the Hogai cache in Texas. And so now I think we can reevaluate what we think about Clovis caches. That flint knappers who couldn't quite get the job done, got all of these mistakes, would gather up their mistakes and bury them so nobody else would know they were that bad a flint knapper. One of the authors here said that he had analyzed over 500 Clovis Points in Texas and had never found a single overshot flake. I began to wonder what he analyzed. But I don't want to get catty anymore. The tools all match. The bone tools, ivory tools match. The fact is, when we were working at Les Aizés, I had the cast of this one along with some of this other stuff. And the archaeologists there, this was during the time they were rebuilding the museum at Les Aizés, they got all excited about this because we got one of those just like that in the Solutrean level while we were re-excavating out here to expand our building. And I said, wow, exciting, but they couldn't, it was all packed away, so I haven't gotten to see it yet. But you get these sagays, as they're called in Europe. We get them. They're reasonably common in Solutrean. We get atlatl hooks. Pretty neat bunch of stuff, I think. And so you get and caches. The scale on this is wrong. The Vaugoux cache, which is the Solutrean one, they're a lot bigger than the Clovis ones. These are from the Drake cache here in Colorado, by the way. This one, he knew how to flake. There are 24 of those in Europe. And I think we're up to a similar number in North America as well. And what the exact meaning of these caches are, we don't know. There's several really good hypotheses, but they need to be tested more. Here's what the coast of northern Spain would look like. This is our model. Here's where a lot of the sites that are been excavated on Solutrean are up in about this elevation. The buffalo is pointed right at the modern coastline. Elevation of the ocean is up here. These guys are up here hunting ibex and red deer and the like. But we're not getting to see what's down here on the continental shelf. And if you're going to live on the continental shelf, these are the resources, even during the Ice Age, that would be available to you. So I think that there's no doubt good archaeological sites on the continental shelf. And then one day the ice moves in close to your abode, and you look out there and you see that the ice had moved in over the night, and there are seals all over that ice. These are harp seals. This particular picture was taken off the coast of Canada just a few years ago, where the seal population was estimated that year at 4 million animals. And that's after many, many years of trying to eliminate that seal population because, of course, they're eating all the codfish. One would love to know what that would look like when it washed up on the shore 20,000 years ago. There must have been a lot of seals out there, and seals are really important, particularly if you're in an ice age environment. And believe me, I've been out there with the Eskimos, and they are very important. So I think once they figured that out, they developed a technology that was pretty close to what our Inuit hunters do. You're out there on the ice, and the more people you get on the ice, you can live out there, the better chances you are of having seals and seabirds such as the great auk. And the important thing is the fat and oil. You need that to survive in that environment. There she is. There she is with her baby. Now we've been told that these people didn't deal with those kinds of resources. Well, they might not, but they sure knew about them because here we have the auk, here we have some deep sea fish, some seals, and maybe some walruses or sea lions. So they're out there, they know what the heck's going on, they're not idiots. There's the auk. That's about a 60-pound bird, that major resource. So here's what the edge would look like. It'd get land rafted, and then your seals would be out through here, And if you had a boat, which we're pretty sure they did, because people all over the world had a boat, so why not these guys? That's what I think they probably had, is skin boats like the ones that the Eskimos use. This is a major transportation boat, and they have sails. I don't believe that the Vikings showed them how to sail. I've been in these boats. Sometimes you can tow another boat, so all your gear's over there. They're pretty good size. There's 13 people in here. There's probably a couple dog teams in one boat or the other, and you are self-sufficient. Fact is, when I first was at Point Barrow, I had 3 native guys come up and say, "We really want to talk to you." So what's up? He says, "We've been to New York." "Oh, yeah? Cool." This was in the 60s. "Why were you in New York? A delegation to the United Nations or what?" No, they had gone off the coast hunting. Ice broke up. They were on an ice island that floated all the way around the North Pole. And it was beginning to get a little small between Iceland and Greenland. They were getting a little nervous, I think. But the Icelandic Coast Guard saw them, picked them up, found out they were Americans, and then they were transported to New York and on back home. You can use these for shelters as well as igloos and things like that. This is a whaling crew in March off the coast of Point Barrow. This is the sea captain. His name is Jonah Levitt. I love that name, Jonah the whaler. This guy here, whoops, back up, come on. Right here, he and I were really close friends back in the 60s, and it was just so great. We wanted to do the BBC was doing a film, and so Bruce made Salutrian-style end blades, and then we adapted them to the spears that these people use, and went out in March. It was, I think, about 40 below zero. The waters get pretty calm along that ice when it gets that cold. And we filmed. It was a marvelous experience, and we loved it. But this gives you an idea of what the waters are like. And I asked these guys, I told them about the Salutrian idea. They look at me, so, you know, anybody could do it. All they have to do is know how. You know? And I love it. So here is what we have proposed. The people are living along this coastline right here. Probably we're getting out on the ice, and eventually some of them made them over here because sometimes that ice would be permanent and you could be out there all the time. It probably wouldn't have been very pleasant, but then again, neither would have the Bering Land Bridge. And they were probably going back and forth. And if you take the distance from Lisbon to New York, it's 4,000 miles. And that's what people say they did. We say they went from here to here, which is 1,200 miles. Totally useful. Oh, can't see the bottom. This is one of these points that was found way down here, but it was made out of material from here. The point should date around 12,500 years old. So how did that point the rock get from there to there? Somebody had to go get it, and they had to do it in a boat. And they had a lot of ocean to cross, and they were going against the Labrador Current. So 12,500 years ago, these people knew how to tack. The other interesting thing is, if you're at all aware of your surroundings, is that these are the currents. This area here of North America was producing major major trees that were not being harvested. They would eventually get into the big waterways like the Savannah, those rivers, down into the Gulf Coast and move up these directions. And this would show up on your coastline. In Iceland during the medieval periods, coastlines were owned by people for the driftwood because wood was so important. And you could be hung for stealing driftwood in Iceland. And the other interesting point is that where did it come from? Someplace out west. Trees bigger than we have ever seen are growing. Let's go look. So, DNA. You will, if you read World Archaeology this week, be able to see this chart. In our book, Bruce and I hypothesized that there was a mitochondrial group called X that made it to North America across the Atlantic Ocean. And we've been severely beaten up by a number of people for that lame idea. However, as it turns out, it's probably real. X forms up here about 61,000 years ago. Comes down, it splits down to X2, 22,000 years ago. Comes over here, splits down, and comes into North America. This is the one that comes from Siberia, has nothing to do with the X in North America. So this is basically telling us that we do have Europeans, people who lived in Europe. Let me back that up. They are not Europeans. They are Paleolithic people who lived in Europe. Europeans moved in from the Caucasus. So here's the maps. These are published. Here's the DNA concentration here, and here that same DNA is at various stages over in Western Europe. And this is the Malta skeleton and Anzick skeleton that we've heard a lot about in the press that proves our hypothesis absolutely wrong. Hard to tell, but here's what people are trying to tell us, that the Malta guys came over here following this line. Think about that. All the way across here, and they're not leaving any descendants. Does that seem like human behavior to you? It doesn't to me. Or the alternative is that they're taking that boat ride. That's our story, and I'm sticking to it. Thank you very much. Well, the bottom line is there's somebody out there 20,000 years ago. We don't know where they're coming from. They may be Solutrean, they may not be. But if they're not, it causes some real questions on how that technology is formed. It looks almost identical. And at the same time. Environmental determinism, maybe. I don't know. But time will tell. But what we can tell you is there are people here in eastern North America 20,000 years ago, regardless of where they came from.